Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start. Many of you, probably most of you, know who I am, but just in case you don't, I'm Richard Turnbull. And I have the privilege of being the chairman of the trustees of the Christian Institute, having succeeded John Byrne in this last year, who, as you know, presided over these occasions and many others with great aplomb and discipline and order. So I apologise in advance for my failings, but I thought I should at least, in honour of John, make sure I started on time. It's great to see John with us, and although this is not the occasion for long speeches, certainly not for me, John has been an amazing chairman of the Christian Institute and extremely humble in coming to the decision that it was time to hand over to somebody else. Those are not easy decisions to make. And I'm immensely proud to be able to take on this job of chairing the Board of Trustees. But more importantly, actually, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, a group of our core supporters. And it's been difficult times, hasn't it? And it's going to take a little bit of time for us to come back together and to get used to meeting again together. But it is important that we do meet together, we share in fellowship, and we share in the work of the gospel. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here last week. One disadvantage of me being the chairman of the trustees is I live in the south of England and John lives just round the corner. So I can be here as much as possible, but not every time. And I think Rupert will have given you a great feast in the book of Jude, because contending for the gospel is essentially what the Christian Institute is about. And there is no greater need for that than now. And that's why in this second lecture we decided that Colin Hart, and I'll introduce Colin and Sam in a moment or two, but would lead this session on looking back at the history of the Christian Institute, how we came about, how we've come to be where we are. And the important message is that the need is no less. In fact, the need is ever greater.
Well, our reading this evening is Psalm 19. Psalm 19, and we're reading the whole of the psalm. So this is for the director of music, a psalm of David. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is hidden from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from willful sins. May they not rule over me. then will I be blameless, innocent of great transgression. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Let's pray. Our gracious God and loving Heavenly Father, how we thank you for the privilege of coming into your presence this evening. We thank you for these words that remind us of your grace in revealing yourself. We thank you that you have revealed yourself in creation. Thank you that the psalmist can speak here so vividly of speech and of the voice that we hear in creation. How we see your glory so clearly displayed. We thank you as well for how you've revealed yourself to us in your word. And thank you that you have given us your law. You've given us your commands. You've given us these precepts that are flawless and perfect. And we thank you that you have revealed yourself to us in this way, that you have not left us in ignorance, but you have revealed to us who we are, who you are, and how you would have us live. We thank you that your ways are good for us, that they are good for all people, all those you have made in your image. We thank you for this opportunity we have this evening to reflect on the work that you have done through the Christian Institute over these 30 years. And we acknowledge that it is your work, that you have grown and blessed this work, and that everything that the Institute has done and achieved has been because of you and because of your presence and because of your provision. We thank you for Colin. We thank you for his faithfulness in serving you over these years. Thank you for the heart that you gave him all those years ago, and the support you gave him, the people you put around him to advise and guide. And we thank you for the organisation the Institute is today, for the staff that you provided, and for the supporters that we have who support us so faithfully, not least in prayer. And so we thank you for this time together. We do pray that you be with our speakers, with Colin and Sam, as they share with us of the work of the Institute and of your goodness and faithfulness. And we pray that we would be encouraged through what we hear this evening, and that we would give you the praise and the glory for what you have done and what we trust you will go on to do through the work of the Institute. So we pray for your presence with us and your blessing upon all that happens this evening. We pray that you will be glorified. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. I suppose if I was to summarise the aims of the Christian Institute, it might be something along the lines of defending Christian truth, defending Christian liberty. All sorts of different things could be said. The speakers don't need very much introduction. Colin Hart was the founding director, if you like, the founding person of the Christian Institute, along with John Byrne, all those years ago. And I suppose it's just that reflection on, wow, God has guided in such an amazing way. And God called John and Colin to establish and to found this institute. He filled them with his grace. He guided them through difficult times and gave a vision. Colin has been the director. Colin was the first employee of the Christian Institute, and that was only part-time. And now there are around about 50 employees of the Christian Institute. No guarantees over what God will have in store for us going forward, but we give thanks to God for that provision. So it will be marvellous to hear from Colin, actually, who's quiet and he's not going to like this, but who's quiet and unassuming, doesn't like to occupy the limelight, but God has used in an extraordinary way. And Sam Webster, who is our solicitor advocate, Sam spends a lot of time working with those affected by issues of religious liberty and Christian liberty and freedom. But he also spends a lot of time as advising people who phone up seeking advice. And Sam and Colin together, along with the rest of the staff, of course, provide that leadership of the Institute, in particularly in those two aspects of the work today. Lots of other things could be said, lots of other people could contribute, but I'm going to hand over to Colin and to Sam to lead us through our session. Colin, thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to talk about how the Institute came to be, and the need is for robust Christians to think Christianly in all areas of life. To do this, we need some kind of institute. The major aim of the Institute would be to equip Christians who are active in the public arena, especially in the media, education, health, and social care. So said John Byrne in a paper, I have it here, written for a small group who met together at Loch Rannoch in May 1988. And the background to this was that John and I had been campaigning to better protect Christian teaching in schools. We met Baroness Cox through this campaign, and the problem was that the 1944 Education Act never specified which faith should be taught. Nobody doubted, actually, that it was Christianity, based on the study of the scriptures. But by the 1980s, religious education had become a multi-faith mishmash, and official syllabuses, in some cases, relegated Christianity to a minor role. And Baroness Cox was determined to change the law so that Christianity had the main place in religious education. So that's a bit of background. And you need to know about that, because in May 1988, it looked certain that the campaign would succeed. The Prime Minister herself, Margaret Thatcher, had intervened and given it her backing, and the details were yet to be worked out. So that was the situation in May, and Caroline Cox thought it would be great to get together and talk about how Christians could be a more effective influence on the nation. And she invited John and I to share some ideas, and we gathered together by Loch Rannoch. There am I. This is me, age 24. And the house where we met is in the distance, and I think David Holloway is probably in the house because he was there as well. And you can see him in his yellow cagoule on that picture. So that's all of us gathered together. And you can see that man looking at the camera quizzically. That's John sitting on what looks like a tank, but it's not actually. It's one of these rovers to get you over Loch Rannoch Moor. And so we're all there, and I'll say more about the Loch Rannoch paper in a moment, but for now, let's jump ahead and say how it led to the setting up of the Christian Institute. We presented the paper, and we had a very pleasant discussion, looking out the window, seeing the moor outside, and then we all went home. A few days later, Caroline phoned to say there was a businessman who was there and heard our presentation, and he wanted to make a donation of £20,000 to help bring our ideas into action. And this was a big shock. I wasn't expecting it at all. Though I think John would say he did have a sense that something could happen. But I thought nothing would. But so we got this phone call, and there was this donation of £20,000 being promised. And after months of discussing various possibilities, John eventually persuaded me to give up my teaching job, which I did in January 1989. And then in June, we shared the vision for the Institute with a group of 11 friends based in the northeast of England. And these came from the worlds of business, education, the church, and medicine. And we proposed the setting up of the Northeast Centre for Christian Education and Training, NESET. It's a snazzy title, I think you'll agree. But by the autumn, an advisory group was formed, and the proposed name was changed to the Christian Institute. The problem was that if we were to adopt the name the Christian Institute, Companies House, the people who regulate companies. We were going to be a company and a Christian institute, charity as well. But Companies House had fairly stringent requirements to be met. We had to get the support of a specified number of national church leaders, references had to be provided by academics, and there was much legal work, and all of this took well over a year. But in God's providence, members of the advisory group seemed to know all the right people who could help us. And we held a launch meeting in March 1991, at which Professor, now Lord Brian Griffiths, spoke. Companies House did eventually agree that we could use the name. And on the 1st of August 1991, the Christian Institute was registered as a company, and we became a charity soon afterwards. Now let's now turn to the paper which started everything off. And since John and I were co-authors, I want to talk about our thinking in the paper and the backgrounds we came from. First, John Byrne. He was then head teacher of Long Benton Community High School, and he wrote most of the paper. John's thinking was heavily influenced by his involvement as a member of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission into Urban Priority Areas, which in 1986 produced the report Faith in the City. He, along with members of the commission, travelled all over the country for 2 years, meeting Christians in the inner city. And John met many people with a lively faith in Christ who worked in deprived areas in the inner city. And their real faith contrasted very starkly with the lack of faith he witnessed amongst the leading bishops and dignitaries he met whilst on the commission. They had a predominantly liberal theology. Many Church of England bishops spoke with great certainty on matters of economics, usually in opposition to the Prime Minister of the day, Margaret Thatcher. But about their own faith, there was no certainty at all. And this was the time the Bishop of Durham was David Jenkins, became bishop in 1984, and he embodied the problems of the Church of England. He pushed his own liberal views on the media all the time. He denied the physical resurrection of Christ, comparing it to conjuring tricks with bones. He rejected the virgin birth. The bishop was never disciplined by the church, and many other bishops held the same views as he did, but were less public about it. John argued in the Rannoch paper that the politicisation of the institutional church had come about because church leaders were influenced by secular humanism and even Marxism. And some of his fellow commissioners on Faith and City were certainly influenced by Marxism. John wrote that when this happens, biblical revelation is drained of its power and becomes social and political comment. And if that was true of institutional and liberal churches, what about genuine believers? Well, John argued that genuine believers had by and large retreated from the world. They saw their faith as applying only to their devotional life and their church activities. Decisions in ordinary life are made without reference to their faith. This was almost elevated to a matter of principle. Christians can then fall into what he called a dualist existence, a Christian life concerned with their church, Bible study, prayer and worship on the one hand, and their ordinary life on the other. Never the twain shall meet. The result being that Christians lived lives which were seen as being no different to those who didn't go to church. So instead of not being conformed to the world, which Paul urges in Romans 12, verse 1, churches were accommodating themselves to the world. They so blended in, they were indistinguishable from the rest of society. And that was John's alarm that he sounded in the Rannoch paper. Well, what was I thinking in 1988? Like John, I was questioning the pietism of much evangelicalism, which viewed only church activities as having approval by God. But back in my university days, this was the view that I held. As a student, I was a compulsive door knocker, sharing my faith in halls. I was really keen on evangelism. And if there was a missionary conference going, I would be there. And I explored becoming a missionary and I went to as many events as I could, exploring that. And I remember hearing speakers say, "Don't waste your life." And I remember saying to the Lord, "I don't want to waste my life. Please make it count." I also felt a burden to pray for revival, that people would turn back to God. And I remember reading a book by the great missionary statesman Michael Griffiths, and he said that we must want to discover the best possible way in which our life could be spent for the glory of God. And I started to read another book, and I think this was by Michael Griffiths too, which said that the main aim of missionary work is the glory of God. Well, I reacted against this. I thought surely the most obvious need was not the glory of God, but for people to become Christians. Nothing could be more important than that, or so I thought. At the age of 20, I concluded that Michael Griffiths didn't know what he was talking about. I put the book down in disgust, and I probably have thrown it away because I've not been able to find it preparing for this lecture. So I went to the European Missionary Conference in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1983, wanting to be a missionary, but I never sensed the Lord's call. So at the conference, I concluded that my dream of track A missionary or evangelistic work wasn't for me. So it was track B for the rest of my life. The second best, I decided to become a teacher. I had enjoyed summer youth camps. I really liked working with young people, and I thought I would enjoy teaching. So though it was track B, at least I knew what I was going to do. So just as I had bad theology on the glory of God, I also had bad theology on work. I thought God was only really interested in full-time evangelists. But when I became a teacher, I had to reevaluate all of this. You couldn't use your maths lessons to convert pupils, obviously. Yes, I helped with the Christian Union and evangelistic events, some quite spectacular evangelistic events we held with hundreds of young people turning out. And I sought to have good attitudes towards my colleagues and the young people I was teaching. But I thought being a Christian teacher meant more than this. I had to be professional. I always had to mark books. I had to prepare lessons and do it well, to the glory of God. So finally the penny dropped. Work should be done to the glory of God. I was wrong, and Michael Griffiths was right after all. Christians had to apply their faith to all of life, to the glory of God, even as a maths teacher. In fact, I so loved mathematics, I was a bit of a geek, that I met up with other keen maths teachers at a national conference in Cambridge University, and that's how keen I was. The trouble was the floors in Selwyn College are highly polished. I slipped and I broke my leg, and no more maths teaching for 3 months. And in my term off, I had plenty of time to kill. So I decided to read. And one of the books that I read was John Pollock's biography of William Wilberforce. That was hugely inspiring. Since student days, I had prayed for revival. I had a growing concern that Christians be an influence on our national life. And I had time to mull this over and read what evangelicals were saying. And that was a good book to start with, really. Some were interested in the work of Jim Wallace of the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C. And in those days, he was much more orthodox than he was to become. But he had some interesting things to say, and I wanted to hear him. He was speaking at Long Benton Community High School. Anyway, I went along. I took the bus and hobbled in on my crutches, and I met this teacher outside the hall where the meeting was to be held, and I said to him, "It must be a tough area." And he said it wasn't so bad. Then I asked, "So what's the head like in this school?" And he said, "Well, you'll have to ask other people, see what they think." And I found later that I was actually speaking to the head, John Byrne himself. And that was our first meeting. A few months later, John was involved with me and others in setting up a Christian Parent-Teacher Association on Tyneside called Christians and Tyneside Schools. And that was to run for 10 years. And it was through campaigning for Christian teaching in schools that both of us met Baroness Cox. Now, like John, I winced when I heard bishops making economic pronouncements with such certainty, and their solutions to our economic woes invariably involved collectivist solutions. Why weren't the bishops concerned? They seemed more concerned with the economic theory than the teaching of Christianity in schools. They certainly weren't concerned with things like abortion, which is a big issue. And on my copy of the Rannoch paper, I actually wrote in biro, and I have it here, that the Institute would oppose the politicization of the church. Yes, Christians would be involved in politics just like Wilberforce. They should speak out for what was right, particularly where the Bible is clear. But Christians mustn't abandon the Bible in favor of some secular political program. So that was some of the thinking. I was a very, very young man. I'm only 24. John was very experienced. Head teacher, I think, were you 48 at the time? I can't remember how old you were. But John had a lifetime, almost a lifetime, of involvement with schools and education and the church at a national level. And together we wanted an institute which would help Christians to guard the gospel, to teach and defend it, to apply their faith to all of life, including the world of work, to resist accommodating to the world and maintain Christian distinctiveness, to contend on political issues where the Bible is clear, and to work to the glory of God. And the Christian Institute has contended for the Christian faith over 30 years. And to talk about the work of the Christian Institute is a very, very big subject. So we're being very selective tonight. It's true to say that members of the advisory group had a massive influence. They were very sticklers for accuracy, particularly John Byrne, and this was to have an unexpected bonus later on. And if you have a reputation for quoting your opponents and politicians accurately, and you don't exaggerate what they say, you don't bear false witness, then it's actually much easier to work with them on other campaigns where you do agree. And we've certainly found that in free speech. So there's been strong disagreements with our opponents, but we don't misrepresent what they say. And that's been useful. Our founding treasurer, the late Alec McNichol, had an enormous impact on ensuring high standards in how we handle money. There's not time to talk about these things, though they were very important. We're also not going to talk about our conferences, publications, meetings, or website, all vital parts of our work. But tonight, and the remaining time, we're going to hear from Sam Webster on his work with the Legal Defence Fund, and then after that, I'll talk about some of our most notable campaigns.
Well, some of you may be aware that the Legal Defence Fund is 15 years old this year. It was formed back in 2006, and you'll be aware that it exists to defend cases of national importance for religious liberty. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about, because the fund is vital. Because the costs of taking a case up to the highest courts can go into hundreds of thousands of pounds. Now, in this work, we seek to set good legal precedents. And by setting good precedents, we can help many more people. So we take the cases and we get the principles from the cases that we win, and we apply those principles on a day-to-day basis in the advice that we give to the many who contact the Institute every year seeking legal advice. And over the past 15 years, God has been pleased to use this work to provide advice to well over 2,500 different Christians. But only a few inquiries become funded court cases. So why do we fund some cases and not others? Well, to qualify for our funding, the central issue in a case has to be one of religious liberty. But there are also three other overriding considerations. Firstly, we're strategic. In Acts 16, we read that Paul and Silas were beaten and thrown into prison, and on release, they claimed their rights as Roman citizens. They sought an apology from the authorities of the day. But it was not for personal redress. No, it was to protect wider gospel freedom. And that also is our approach in the cases that we take. Secondly, we seek to establish good judicial precedents, as I said earlier. Because when a judge applies the law to a set of facts, he's developing new case law which will be cited in future cases. Now, bad facts make for bad law. So we have to be incredibly careful. For example, we only defend responsible behaviour. Not all street preachers, for example, are wise in the way they act. And thirdly, we ask this question. We ask, is there a reasonable prospect the proceedings we fund will be successful? Now, that doesn't mean the case will win. Sometimes important points need to be tested in court. And we're mindful that it's perfectly possible to lose in a court of law, but still win in the court of public opinion. But we don't pursue cases which cannot be properly argued, for example, because the law and the facts are clearly against us. So we've now been involved in court cases in all parts of the United Kingdom and at every level of the court system. And it's been a privilege for me over the past 13 and a half years, nearly, to work with some fine Christians in their stand for gospel freedom. Not all our cases have resulted in victory in court, but even some of the disappointments have paved the way for future success. Take Lillian Liddell. Lillian was a marriage registrar at Islington Council, and she was forced out of her job because of her Christian objection to conducting same-sex civil partnership duties. So we supported her in bringing a claim for religious discrimination against Islington Council, and she won her employment tribunal case in 2008. But her victory was subsequently overturned in the higher courts. So ultimately, she lost her case in the European Court of Human Rights. But her case did help secure some very important changes which improve the way the UK courts now engage with religious liberty issues. Similarly, you may remember Peter and Hazel Mary Bull, Christians who ran a guest house near Penzance, and they would only provide a double room to married opposite-sex couples. In 2008, they refused a same-sex couple a double room. So with public funding, the couple sued the Bulls for sexual orientation discrimination under new laws that have been brought in. So we supported the Bulls. For us, it was about the freedom of Christians to decide what happens under their own roof so as to maintain a clear conscience before God. Peter and Hazel Marie said that their policy was not about sexual orientation, but about sexual conduct outside marriage, and so they relied upon their legal right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But in 2013, the Supreme Court upheld the judgments of lower courts and ruled by 3 justices to 2 that the Bulls' policy was directly discriminatory on grounds of sexual orientation. Now, this was an incredibly difficult case, but it was one that had to be defended to clarify the scope of the law. And despite the loss, there were elements in the judgment which gave us a basis to build on in future cases. So the Supreme Court accepted the potential for reasonable accommodation of religious conscience in how discrimination law is applied, and the court accepted, in principle, that the bull's belief about marriage engaged fundamental religious rights. Unusually, the Supreme Court refused to order us to pay the other side's costs, having lost. Such was the public importance of this case. Now, fast forward 5 years, and we had Ash's Baking Company, an immensely challenging but enjoyable case. In 2015, the MacArthur family, who own and manage Ash's, declined to ice a campaign cake with the slogan, "Support gay marriage." Now, the customer got his cake iced elsewhere, but he still sued Ash's for discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation and on grounds of political opinion. This case raised vital questions about whether a Christian business could be compelled to promote a cause with which it profoundly disagrees. And there were complex arguments at stake involving compelled speech, and we had to work very hard to develop them. You will recall that Ash's then lost their case in the Belfast County Court, and again on appeal in the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal. Significantly, the court said they would simply follow in the Supreme Court's judgment in the Bulls case. Now, the court rules in Northern Ireland made it unlikely that a full appeal would then be heard in the Supreme Court. But by God's grace, an appeal was heard in full in 2018. And the Supreme Court unanimously overturned the earlier judgments. The Supreme Court said that this case was not like the Bulls case before it. Now, crucially, the Supreme Court said that the MacArthur's objection had been to the message on the cake, not to the gay customer and not to the wider gay community. In so doing, the court held that the scope to sue for discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation was not as extensive as some gay rights activists perhaps thought. And on the issue of political opinion discrimination, the court used human rights law to interpret equality law. And Lady Hale, the then President of the Supreme Court, ruled, "In my view, the law on political discrimination should not be read or given effect in such a way as to compel providers of goods, facilities, and services to express a message with which they disagree, unless justification is shown for doing so." And that's referring to weighty justification is needed. And this ruling now stands as a landmark precedent on the issue of compelled speech, with some very, very important implications. Now, moving on. In terms of the case which has impacted the most people, I would cite the Christian Institute's judicial review of the Children and Young People's Scotland Act 2014. The Act, passed by the Scottish Parliament, required that every child in Scotland would have a named person. That's a state employee to oversee their well-being. Now, according to the Act, the named person could act where he considers it to be appropriate to safeguard the well-being of the child or young person. And crucially, the Act stated that well-being was to be assessed by reference to some very broad and some incredibly vague indicators. There was no actual definition of well-being in the legislation. And so it was our conviction that the creation of a state-sponsored named person for every child in Scotland threatened the God-given role of parents as the primary carers of their children. So we brought a a challenge in the courts to the legislation. After losing in the courts in Edinburgh, we pursued a further appeal to the UK Supreme Court. And after a 2-day hearing in London in 2016, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the named person legislation breached fundamental constitutional law. In short, the court ruled that the information sharing provisions central to the named person legislation, central to the scheme, breached the fundamental right to a private and family life. And helpfully, the court also stressed that parents, and not the state, have primary responsibility for raising their children. In a very powerful quote from the judgment, the court said this: "The first thing that a totalitarian regime tries to do is get at the children, to distance them from the subversive, varied influences of their families and indoctrinate them in their ruler's view of the world. Within limits, families must be left to bring up their children in their own way." As for the Scottish Government, it was unable to fix the legislation. And so in 2019, they announced its full repeal from the statute book. Now, meanwhile, the judgment in Christian Institute and Lord Advocate has been cited in a range of other cases on all sorts of issues. But our most cited case is Adrian Smith and Trafford Housing Trust. You may recall that Adrian was a housing manager at the trust, and in 2011 he was demoted with a 40% pay cut for a private Facebook post in which he said that same-sex weddings would be an equality too far in church. Same-sex weddings in churches would be an equality too far. So we helped Adrian bring a claim in the High Court. For us, the case raised much wider issues about when employees may be disciplined for expressing their beliefs. And so we were thankful when Mr. Justice Briggs ruled that Adrian had done nothing wrong and that the trust had acted unlawfully. Then we come to our most shocking case. You may remember this. Back in 2009, Ben and Sharon Vogelenzang, and they faced criminal charges. They went to a criminal dock after expressing their beliefs in their own home. So in 2009, Ben and Sharon, hoteliers from Liverpool, were prosecuted for insulting a Muslim guest in their hotel after discussing with her whether Jesus is the Son of God or simply a prophet. Now, in this case, the stakes were very high. 2 Christians in a criminal dock. But it also felt as if the freedom of each one of us was on trial. It was not insignificant that the lead police officer on the case held a top European award for her work on hate crime. And so it was a massive relief when Ben and Sharon were found not guilty after a 2-day trial which was reported across the world. And I'm pleased to say in the 12 years since, we've not had to defend a similar case. And I think that simply defending this case in the face of widespread media publicity had a vital positive effect. Now, one case where victory was snatched from the jaws of defeat was in 2011, when we defended Bideford Town Council after the National Secular Society challenged Bideford's practice of starting their council meetings with prayer, a practice which in Bideford originated from the time of Queen Elizabeth I. And we were alarmed, because if council prayers were unlawful, other expressions of faith in the public square would also be at risk. So it was a huge shock when the secularists won their judicial review and the common practice of council prayers was declared to be unlawful. But it was on the narrow basis. The judge found it on a narrow basis, and he said that it was because councils do not have the legal power to include prayers at their meetings. But significantly, the court rejected the wider basis of the secularist case, which was that council prayers, said the secularists, breach the rights of non-Christians and discriminate against them. The judge ruled this: I cannot see that his, that's the atheists, freedom of religion, thought or conscience is infringed by the degree of embarrassment he feels, which is no more than is inherent in the exercise by the others their freedom to manifest their religious beliefs, and his, the atheist's, freedom to stay without participating or to leave. Common sense, you might think, but this part of the ruling imposed some helpful limits on the use of discrimination and human rights law as a secularizing measure. And it was a ruling which could not be appealed by the secularists because they had won the case, and only the loser in a case can initiate an appeal. As for our technical defeat, it was reversed by Parliament. New, wider powers for local authorities came into force within a few weeks. And then the Local Government Religious Observances Act 2015 put matters beyond all doubt. The Act provides that councils in England may include time for prayers or other religious observance in their meetings, and may support or facilitate or make arrangements to be represented at a religious event. Not what the secularists had anticipated. So, the big cases are vital in helping to shape our freedoms. Our three most cited cases have been cited in scores of other judgments. But it's not always necessary to go to court. You may recall that we settled court proceedings against Google in 2008 when the internet giant agreed to lift their worldwide ban on adverts for pro-life clinics. And in another case in 2013, the Northern Ireland Charities Act was helpfully amended after we simply threatened a judicial review in response to the Northern Ireland Charities Commission's attempt to assess the membership criteria of churches. Just as I wrap up, looking to the future, we face new challenges. One of our current big cases is for Cornerstone North East Fostering Service. In 2020, Cornerstone succeeded in the High Court in challenging Ofsted's ban on it only recruiting evangelical Christian carers. But the court also ruled, unhelpfully, that Cornerstone may not expect such evangelical carers to live out biblical teaching on marriage, as if biblical ethics can be separated from the Christian walk. So with our support, Cornerstone is currently seeking to take their case to the UK Supreme Court. Now back to Colin to talk about our campaigns. Thank you.
Well, over the years, we've run campaigns on well over 30 major issues related to marriage and the family, religious liberty, the sanctity of life, drugs, education, and the Constitution. Campaigns often come back again and again in different bills or in different parts of the UK. The need to defend marriage, gospel freedom, and the sanctity of life have been three constants throughout the years of our existence. And I just want to mention 5 campaigns which illustrate our work. They are campaigns where there's been a strenuous level of activity and significant workload for us, often sometimes going on for more than a year. 3 of the cases I want to mention concern the family, so we'll look at those first. Sam spoke about the named person campaign. It won in the Supreme Court. But as well as working in the court of law, as Sam mentioned, that we worked in the court of public opinion. And we exposed what was going on under the named person scheme. And all the work we were doing in public was really vital. I think we had 40 meetings around Scotland, and people were turning up. Many times there were more non-Christians in the meeting than there were Christians. The grandparents were showing up, parents were showing up, and they were providing us with the key evidence which we funneled through to the legal team. And so it worked really well. Significant non-Christian parents were really vital in the campaign, and we even worked with other organisations that had concerns about the legislation. And these people could sense that by appointing named persons for every child in Scotland, something was very wrong. Parents have a God-given relationship with their children. They have a natural authority. The fifth commandment enshrines this. There is nothing more natural than the love of parents for a child, and there's no way the state can protect and nurture a child the way that parents can. Thanks to God's common grace, many people understand that who are not Christians. And the issue of marriage is really vital, and if I could just mention the issue of marriage, and particularly where we are in Newcastle, where we had Norman Dennis was in the university, and he had a group of colleagues in the sociology department, and it became, I think, difficult for them, and they eventually left, and I think many of them ended up in the religious studies department. But they went on and on about this fact, that children do best across a whole range of outcomes if they are raised by married parents. Compared to those who are raised in other types of households, children raised by married parents normally have better health, higher educational attainment, and are less likely to be unemployed and less likely to commit crime. So this is what Norman Dennis at Newcastle University was saying along with his colleagues, and they were publishing book after books. And Norman Dennis never tired of pointing to the evidence from social science on marriage, and it was a pleasure to work with him. And Norman wrote several publications for us. Marriage is the basic unit of society. It has been the norm across all times and cultures. And sadly, this norm is being rejected in the West. Children are suffering as a result. And it was Norman's work on the married family which was such an encouragement to us and an inspiration in our campaigns. The first time I worked with Norman on a campaign was for no-fault divorce. And back in 1996, I was involved in resisting the introduction of a no-fault divorce bill. And so under the bill, instead of needing to allege a fault such as adultery, the government bill was to ensure that no-fault divorce was available within a year. So this was back in 1996. And it was a tremendous honour to work with Baroness Young and Edward Lee MP to oppose the scheme. And they did what they could to protect marriage. In fact, the bill was so heavily amended that the Law Society withdrew its backing for the bill. The Law Society said that the bill had now become an obstacle course for divorce. And that was what the divorce lawyers said. They wanted to grease the tracks of divorce rather than save marriages. But the bill was so amended by Christian MPs and others that they said it was an obstacle course to divorce. And fortunately, going on from there, the bill's pilot schemes were disastrous. Couples wanting to divorce rejected the use of non-legally qualified mediators, which was one of the main planks of the bill to cut costs. People who were not qualified in law could be used to help make decisions about house, children's residence, and property and money. So they didn't want to go with the use of mediators in the pilot schemes, so the incoming Labour government decided to abandon the legislation entirely. But sadly, that was 1996, 1997. Sadly, though, last year, Boris Johnson pushed a no-fault divorce through Parliament. And what we stopped in 1996 became law 25 years later. Now, people could say this, surely you knew it was going to come into force one day. No-fault divorce was so popular amongst lawyers and judges, it was inevitable. So why try and delay it? Well, we did help delay it by 25 years, and I believe hundreds of marriages would be saved by the result. And you can track through the figures and see there are always more people who file for divorce than actually get a divorce. There's always a lag. There's a difference between the two. And there are hundreds and hundreds of couples who decide to remain married. Now, we eventually lost that campaign, but fighting no-fault divorce, as well as saving marriages, I believe, it was the right thing to do, and it glorified God. My third campaign on the family was the most difficult of all, same-sex marriage. All the main political parties backed it. Of course, David Cameron promised he would not introduce it, and then when he became Prime Minister, did introduce it. It was a long campaign, 3 years in total from beginning to end, because Scotland had its own legislation as well. And if a majority on any topic, if a majority of the government's own backbenchers oppose a government bill, usually the legislation has to be abolished. That's a fact of political life. Normally that happens. If your own side won't even support your own legislation, the bill is sunk. But that didn't happen with same-sex marriage because the Prime Minister, David Cameron, was able to get the bill through with Labour and Lib Dem votes. Now, we know that when Christians lose a battle on public morality, it isn't long before religious liberty cases arise. And same-sex marriage shows this in the way that has happened. Once they had won, campaigners acted as though Parliament had passed a law requiring everyone to agree with same-sex marriage. They hadn't. And we can see with the Ashes case what the expectation was there. The threat to religious liberty was sufficient reason for fighting same-sex marriage, and it was a good, pragmatic reason, but once again, it wasn't the most important reason, and that was the glory of God. Redefining marriage dishonours God who gave us marriage, and if marriage is a picture of Christ's love for his church, then same-sex marriage is a blasphemy. It equates what is holy and good with what is plainly wrong. Parliaments can redefine it as many times as they like, but marriage will always be between a man and a woman. And we know this because God's word tell us so. And our conscience also speaks, although people can suppress their conscience. Psalm 19, my favourite psalm, speaks of the splendour both of creation and God's law. There is beauty and order in both. Psalm 19 and Romans 1 say that you cannot not know that God is our creator. And Romans 1 goes on to speak of unbelievers knowing what they do is wrong, including homosexual practice. And Romans 2, verses 15 and 16, tells us that our consciences affirm us when we do what is right and accuse us when we do what is wrong. God's law is written on our hearts, but the married family is one of many areas in which people's hearts have become hardened in our society. So 3 very, very big campaigns we fought on marriage and the family, the named person, no-fault divorce, and same-sex marriage. A 4th issue I want to mention is church employment freedom. Now, equality law protects the ability of religious organisations to employ people who share their beliefs. So a Jewish school can insist that the head teacher be a Jew. An evangelical church can insist that their youth worker is a Bible believer. And these legal protections are used every day by thousands of organisations. Without them, militant atheists or LGBT activists could sue a church for refusing to employ them. But these protections only exist because of the work of the Christian Institute. In 1997, we spotted that a European Union directive was proposing to give power to the EU to control employment legislation. We knew that it would be used by gay rights activists against churches. So we started a campaign which effectively lasted over a decade. And these are our materials. I think we distributed 70,000 copies of this handbill. In 2000, the EU brought in an employment directive which outlawed discrimination on the grounds of religion and sexual orientation. Now, of course, in most situations, you would not defend discrimination. But when a church turns down an atheist or an unrepentant homosexual as a youth leader, it isn't denying their humanity or their civil rights. It's simply protecting its own ability to exist as a church. And gay groups have the same parallel rights to employ LGBT people in their organisations too. But back then, none of this was settled. We ran a big public campaign against the directive, and when it was clear that we couldn't stop it, we ended up speaking to British officials involved with the negotiations, and we made sure there would be scope for EU member states to give exemptions, and they inserted wording which guaranteed it. In 2003, the government brought in laws to implement the directive, as it was required to do, and they were under a lot of pressure not to include exemptions for churches, but we made sure that they did. However, in 2009, the Labour government tried to repeal the exemption for sexual orientation. It would have meant that you could require a job recruit to be a Christian, but if they told you they were a gay Christian, you would be breaking the law if you turned them down. We worked with Baroness O'Cahoyne to try and block what the then Labour government was doing, and we defeated the government hands down on the main principle in the House of Lords. But then the government was unscrupulous, and it overturned the rules of precedent in the House of Lords. It forced extra votes on consequential amendments, which are normally never done. Normally you vote on a principle, and then the consequential amendments are just taken as carried. But this government the Labour government then forced a vote on every single consequential amendment. But peers held firm, and I think we had a vote originally of 125, but the last consequential amendment, which we had to win, peers were going home all the time, and there was a lot of confusion as the evening went on. I think we won by 5 votes, our last consequential amendment, including the Archbishop of York. He stayed, Archbishop Santamu stayed to the very, very end, which we were very grateful for. Peers held firm, and that's why you can't sue a church for only employing Christians who live by biblical sexual ethics. And our last campaign I want to talk about is, in a way, the celebrated campaign, the Racial and Religious Hatred Bill. In the last 20 years, there has been a disturbing trend where people think they can use the criminal law to settle a public debate. And we've fought a number of hugely important campaigns on free speech over the years. And in many ways, where we really cut our teeth was on the campaign against the government's Racial and Religious Hatred Bill in 2005 to 6. And this was the third piece of legislation, the third attempt that the government had to introduce a religious hatred law. It wrote to every mosque at the election before, promising there would be a religious hatred bill. I think many people thought it would be certainly a Muslim blasphemy law, and so they were very keen to have it. But its terms were very chilling. It included a maximum 7-year prison sentence, and it covered insulting words or behaviour deemed likely to stir up hatred. There was even a Home Office frequently asked questions section on the government website, and it had the question, could it break the law if you say that Jesus is the only way to salvation? And it basically said, yes, you can, in certain circumstances. And that was how the bill was. But the problem is the very nature of religious debate involves saying someone else or something else is morally wrong. It's bound to be insulting to someone. And we know that the gospel causes offence. And the danger with the religious hatred law was not just there would be prosecution. There was a danger there would be prosecutions. But more than that, it was the chilling effect, the self-censorship through fear. It would have seen some Christians back off from saying the more offensive parts of the gospel, including that Christ is the only way to God. And if the racial and religious hatred bill had been passed as the government intended, gospel freedom, it wouldn't have been ended overnight, but cases would have been brought against Christians, and our freedom to share the gospel would have been steadily eroded. And that's why so many Christians were concerned. And there was a very significant level of prayer going on during the campaign, right up to its extraordinary conclusion. It wasn't only Christians that were concerned about the legislation. We had a remarkable, indeed unholy alliance with atheists, secularists, including Mr. Bean actor Rowan Atkinson. Some of the contacts we made at that time helped us with subsequent free speech campaigns. We might disagree, and frequently do, very publicly with them, on many other issues, but we can find common cause on free speech. And Christians have been able to be co-belligerents with others in this area. Well, in January 2006, the House of Commons was faced with this question: did it accept the government's plan law without any changes, or did it insist on a package of safeguards written in by the House of Lords to protect free speech and evangelism? After a lengthy debate, MPs voted for all the safeguards. The crunch vote was secured by a majority of just one MP. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was wrongly advised that his vote wasn't needed, so he went home. And he didn't vote. If he'd stayed and voted, the government would have won and we would have lost. The Christian Institute has been around now for 30 years, and in one of our biggest campaigns, we won by a single vote, the vote of the Prime Minister. As Proverbs 21, verse 1 says in the Authorized Version, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will." Thank you.
If you doubted at the beginning of the evening whether the need for the Christian Institute was ever more crucial today, I trust you do not doubt at the end of the evening. It's a great presentation. I learned an amazing amount, and just to have that history presented for us, the background to the Institute, the legal cases, the campaigns, and as Colin said, so much more could have been talked about.
How do you relate to care in London?
Well, on the no-fault divorce bill, I worked with CARE. They actually helped pay for my time. It was very early days of the Christian Institute. So we do talk to them. Certainly Simon, my colleague, talks all the time to CARE. And so on euthanasia, CARE was really one of the main organisations campaigning on that. So we network with them. So some issues they would, certainly on the issue of euthanasia, much more involved with that than we were on the front line. So we certainly network with organisations, not just CARE, but lots of others as well.
Thank you. What issues do you feel the Institute are going to be faced with in the next 2 or 3 years?
Might be you again.
I don't know, Sam. Well, that's a difficult one. I think the euthanasia issue is not going to go away, and that's also going to be fought in Scotland. I think the transsexual issue will not go away. At the moment, there is a very strong opposition to it, even within the government. And that's being played out in newspapers, people arguing different points. But I think there's going to be some very difficult arguments in medical ethics, I think, as well, on some very complicated things. I mean, most of the time, the issues we've been involved in, the theology has been desperately simple, about marriage. Is it between one man and one woman or not? That's a very simple thing. I often say the theology of our campaigns is simple. But sometimes there are complex issues, like embryology. That is complicated. What happens if the government of the day wants to change our genes so that there's a permanent change to the human race and the experiments on it, designer babies, the whole things that we thought had gone away? What happens if they all come back again? So I think they could come back, and the science of that is quite complicated, but the principle is quite simple. So I fear all of that, but there's lots more to do on trying to stand up for free speech and the whole cancel culture as well. It's very difficult for students on campus and for lecturers. And that one is going to get worse before it gets better, I think.
Is there any significance in the government or various government departments cancelling the Stonewall subscription?
Yes, great news. And Simon, my colleague Simon Calvert, says we've been praying for this for years, that the truth will out. Well, the truth has come out. And the BBC, incredibly, did a whole documentary, 10-series podcast by Stephen Nolan, into what Stonewall was up to. Campaigning, telling the Scottish Government they've got to drop the word mother, for example. And telling people the law says something when the law does not say something. And in a way, that was the last straw. And I'm so glad that some government departments have been saying. Certainly the Crown Prosecution Service was a Stonewall diversity champion, I think, and they were part of the scheme, but it was pointed out to them Stonewall was actually misrepresenting the law. It was saying that women didn't have certain rights when they did have certain rights. So I'm very glad that's what's happening. There is a division as well within gay groups. They're all arguing amongst each other now. Some are against transsexual rights, some are for them. But it seems many of them are against. So that's where we are, and it's good at least there's a public debate. So I'm very thankful that government departments are withdrawing the funding because obviously they get a substantial amount of funding from the public purse. We don't. We don't get any funding from the government. So Stonewall has always had that benefit, and I'm glad if they can actually not get all these millions of pounds coming in from the government.
The devil always overplays his hand, and that is how what we regard as amazing and extraordinary isn't, because we trust in God, and the devil invariably overplays his hand, and I think we've seen some of that in the Stonewall situation.
Sam spoke about the importance of the Asher's baking case for the issue of compelled speech, which I suppose is the other side of the coin of freedom of speech. It's the right not to be forced to say something you disagree with. And I wonder if Sam would like to just expand a bit on how he sees the implications of that playing out.
Well, the importance of the Asher's case on compelled speech was the way it got Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the freedom to express a belief, and they looked at the negative side of that, the opposite side of it, the right not to express a belief you don't believe in. And then having got that principle, they used it to interpret other laws in such a manner as to protect that freedom not to express a belief you don't believe in. So yes, I can see that precedent now having been set, how much easier it will be for the courts in the future, particularly perhaps on the transgender issue, amongst others, to construe equality law in a manner which lawyers call read it down. They read down the law, so they don't negate the law, but they read it in a way that actually ultimately defends and upholds the freedom of conscience and the freedom of speech of those who actually take an opposite view. And I think that's more likely to happen now on the transgender issue than it was previously in light of the decision of the Employment Appeal Tribunal earlier this year in the Mayor for Stater case. Because previously an employment tribunal had said that the belief that gender is fixed to sex and can't be changed, that belief wasn't worthy of protection in a democratic society. Well, the Employment Appeal Tribunal has now overturned that. So I think the door is open for us to build on the compelled speech arguments in cases where people perhaps are forced out of their jobs in the future for refusing to use certain pronouns in certain contexts. But that needs to be properly tested in the courts. So thank you.
One of my great concerns at the moment is what very young children are being taught in school to do with things like same-sex marriage, different kinds of relationships. Has the Christian Institute actually been involved in any cases along these lines? Or if not, do they think this is something that's going to happen pretty soon?
One of the things that's interesting, and Sam might back me up on this, I hope he will, is that young people also have freedom of speech too. And we've had some cases where it's always been difficult to get a case, but we've heard of heart-wrenching stories of young people being humiliated in class because of their beliefs. And quite understandably, normally the parents want to leave that school. They don't want to fight the case, so they take their stand by leaving and they tell the school why they are leaving. But we've not had a case. But if a child was forced to say something against their will, or was experiencing basically a course in indoctrination on transsexuality or on same-sex marriage, then they would have rights. And in fact, Sam is running a case at the moment on this very thing.
So it's not just treatment of particular pupils, but it's government guidance or local authority guidance on those issues in different areas. So the case that Colin refers to is not yet in the public domain, so I won't be too expansive about it, but it is a local authority whose guidance for all schools in that particular county, particularly on the transgender issue, simply amounts to indoctrination. So we do have a judicial review claim in the courts at the moment, which has a hearing next month. And I'm sure more will be said at the time or after in relation to that issue. So yes, and in fact there was another case, Warwickshire, 2020. We started pre-action legal correspondence with Warwickshire County Council, taking on its relationships, education and transgender guidance, or in fact actual lesson plans, curriculums, materials. But we then didn't have to take it any further, because as soon as we sent the legal action letter, pre-action letter, Warwickshire County Council withdrew all the materials they were using in schools in that county. So, yeah.
Great, thank you all very much, and a huge thank you to Colin and to Sam for presenting, but presenting, of course, on behalf of all of the staff of the Christian Institute. And I think from your questions you showed the importance of the work, the continued importance of the work, and the challenges to come.